Imagine being boiled alive in the town square, while your neighbors watch and cheer. This was not a nightmare. This was the law. In the Middle Ages, justice was not a courtroom. It was a stage, and the punishments were built to do one thing: to be remembered forever. People were branded, broken, and torn apart in public over crimes as small as stealing bread or talking back to a husband. And the people who lived in this world, who watched it happen, were your ancestors. Today we count down the 10 most brutal medieval punishments ever used. Watch until the end and ask yourself one honest question. Would you survive a single day? Let us begin. Number 10, the pillory and the stocks. We start with something that sounds almost gentle. It was not. The pillory was a wooden frame. It locked your head and your hands in place, forcing you to stand bent over for hours, sometimes for days. You could not move, you could not eat, you could not wipe your own face. The crime did not have to be serious. Selling rotten meat, cheating with weights at the market, spreading gossip, drunkenness, these were enough. But the wood was not the punishment, the crowd was. People threw rotten food, mud, dead animals, and stones. And here is the dark truth. Sometimes the crowd threw heavy objects on purpose. People left the pillory blinded, some left with broken skulls, some did not leave alive at all. You were not just being punished, you were being given to the mob, and the mob decided how far it went. Number 9, branding with hot iron. In a world without photographs, without records, without identity papers, how do you mark a criminal forever? You burn it into their skin. Branding used a heated iron pressed directly onto the body, the face, the hand, the forehead, the cheek. A thief might be branded with a letter T, a blasphemer with a B, a fighter or brawler with an F. The letter told everyone, for the rest of your life, exactly what you were. The pain was extreme, but the real punishment came after. You could never start over. You could never move to a new town and pretend to be innocent. The mark followed you to your grave. Imagine making one mistake at 18 years old and wearing it on your face for 50 more years. That was mercy by medieval standards, because branding was one of the lighter sentences. Number 8, the Scold's Bridle. This one was built for a very specific kind of victim, women who talk too much. The Scold's Bridle, also called the brank, was an iron cage that locked around the head. Inside was a metal plate that pressed down on the tongue. Some had sharp spikes. Speaking, swallowing, or moving the tongue caused bleeding and pain. The crime: gossip, arguing with a husband, nagging, speaking against a man in public. A woman could be locked into this device and then led through the streets on a chain so the whole town could laugh. It was not really about justice. It was about silence. It was about reminding an entire population who was allowed to speak and who was not. And it stayed in use far longer than most people realize. Some versions were still being used just a few centuries ago. Number 7, public flogging. Now the blood begins. Flogging meant being stripped, tied to a post or a cart, and whipped in front of the public. The whip was often knotted. Sometimes it had metal pieces woven into it to tear the skin with every strike. The number of lashes was set by the judge: 20, 50, 100. For a weak person, 50 lashes was a death sentence delivered slowly. The crimes ranged from theft to debt to insulting a noble. You did not have to kill anyone, you just had to be poor and unlucky. And often the victim was dragged behind a moving cart through the town while the whipping continued, so that no street would miss the show. By the end, the back was not skin anymore, it was open meat, and the crowd watched it all. Number 6, trial by water and the ducking stool. This punishment hid behind a horrifying logic. They believed God himself would reveal the guilty. A person, very often a woman accused of witchcraft, was tied up and thrown into deep water. Here was the trap. If you floated, you were guilty. The water had rejected you, so you were a witch, and you would be executed. If you sank, you were innocent. There was just one problem. You usually drowned proving it. The ducking stool was the slower version. The accused was strapped to a chair on a long wooden arm and dunked under the water again and again. Sometimes for punishment, sometimes until they confessed, sometimes until they stopped moving. There was no good answer. The system was built so that the victim could never win. Survival itself was treated as proof of guilt. Number 5. The rack. We have reached the machines now, and the rack is the one everyone fears. The rack was a wooden frame with a roller at each end. The victim was tied by the wrists and the ankles. Then, slowly the body was stretched. First the discomfort. Then the joints of the shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows were pulled apart. The torturer could hear the moment the joints popped out of their sockets. It was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to extract confessions. And it worked, because people will confess to anything to make it stop. They confessed to crimes they never committed. They named friends who were innocent. They begged for death. Many who survived the rack never walked again. Their bodies were permanently destroyed. They were broken people for the rest of their lives, kept alive as a warning. Number 4. Immurement. This is one of the quietest and cruelest punishments ever invented. There was no blade, no fire, no crowd throwing stones. There was only a wall. Immurement meant sealing a living person inside a small space, a wall, a pit, a tiny stone room with no exit. The victim was placed inside, and then the opening was closed with brick and stone. Sometimes a small gap was left to pass in a little food and water, so the death would take many days. Sometimes nothing was left at all. Imagine the silence, the darkness, knowing that no one was coming, hearing the last stone being set into place, and then waiting, fully aware, as hunger and thirst and madness did the rest. It was a punishment of pure abandonment. The world simply closed the door and walked away. Number 3. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel was so feared that in some regions it was called the worst death a human could face. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel with their limbs stretched across the spokes. Then the executioner took a heavy iron bar or a hammer and began to break every bone in the body. The legs, the arms, one strike at a time. But death was not the goal yet. Skilled executioners knew exactly how to shatter the bones without killing. Then came the final horror. The broken, twisted body was woven through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel was raised on a tall pole, and the still living victim was left in the open air to die over hours, sometimes over days, exposed to the sun and the birds. People could survive on that wheel, conscious for 2 or 3 days, begging for an end that would not come. Number 2. Boiling alive. Some crimes, like poisoning or counterfeiting coins, were considered so dangerous that ordinary death was not enough. The punishment had to be theatrical. It had to be unforgettable. So they used water, or oil, or sometimes molten lead. A huge cauldron was placed over a fire in the public square. The victim was lowered inside. Sometimes the liquid was already boiling, ending things in screaming minutes. Sometimes, and this was worse, the victim was placed in cold water and the fire was lit underneath. So the crowd could watch the slow climb from warmth to pain to unimaginable agony. This was a sanctioned, legal punishment in parts of medieval Europe. A spectacle, entertainment even. People brought their families, and the screams were considered part of the lesson. Number 1. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. We have reached the one. The punishment reserved for the highest crime of all, treason against the king. It was not one death. It was a sequence of deaths performed in order, in public. First, the victim was dragged through the streets behind a horse. Then they were hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive and still conscious. Then came the part that made strong men in the crowd faint. The executioner cut open the body and removed the organs, one by one, while the victim was still breathing. The intestines were often burned in front of the dying person, so the last thing they witnessed was their own body being destroyed. And only then, finally, was the head cut off. The body was then cut into 4 pieces, quartered. The pieces were sent to different cities and displayed on spikes and gates as a permanent warning to anyone who even thought about defying the crown. This was the law, written down, approved, carried out in front of cheering thousands. This was justice in the Middle Ages. So look again at your own life. The worst day you have ever had. The greatest unfairness you have ever suffered. Now place it next to a wheel raised on a pole, or a wall being sealed brick by brick, or a cauldron heating slowly over a fire. For most of human history, this was reality. Not a horror story, not fiction, the everyday machinery of justice. And the people who lived through it, who watched it, who feared it every single day, were not strangers. They were your ancestors, your blood, the reason you exist at all. They survived a world that we can barely imagine. So ask yourself one last time, honestly, with no whip at your back and no crowd screaming for your blood, would you have lasted a single day? If this video disturbed you, then it did its job. Subscribe and stay for the next dark chapter of history.